Good evening and welcome to Solidarity on Tap. My name is Chris Kerr with the Ignatian Solidarity Network, and on behalf of our ISN family as well as our national Solidarity on Tap sponsors, the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, Corps Northwest, Jesuitical Podcast of America Media, the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara, Maryknoll Lay Missioners, and the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. Thanks to everyone for joining in tonight. For over 15 years, the Ignatian Solidarity Network has been uniting the Ignatian family. That means the Jesuit network, as well as those who are inspired to work for justice through the spiritual tradition of St. Ignatius of Loyola, to build a more just world through faith-based social justice formation, education, and advocacy. If you haven't already, please check out our website, ignatiansolidarity.net, and like and follow us on social media to get the latest advocacy alerts, educational resources, and much more. Solidarity on Tap usually takes place in cities across the country, bringing together members of the Ignatian family. And even though we're gathering virtually tonight, the goal of Solidarity on Tap is the same: to invite people to enjoy fellowship, maybe with a drink in hand, and to hear powerful reflections from members of the network engaged in work for justice. In order to build and enjoy fellowship tonight, I encourage you to utilize the comments section on Facebook, YouTube, or post a tweet with the hashtag ISNLive to let us know you're there and your institutions are represented here tonight. And please know that you can post your comments and questions for our guest speakers this evening on either Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube as well. And if you're on Twitter, make sure to use that hashtag ISNLive. As we join together tonight as an Ignatian family, we know that there are members of our global family who are experiencing great sadness, suffering, and struggle because of this global pandemic. We are gathered in this virtual space in the name of solidarity, and in doing so, I would invite you to join the Ignatian Solidarity Network in keeping all God's people in our thoughts and prayers this evening, especially the vulnerable, the marginalized, those who have lost loved ones, and the sick. We join together with this wish that the conversation tonight provides us the opportunity to reflect on the idea of radical hope, a theme the Ignatian Solidarity Network has been reflecting on over the past year. So with this in mind, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Marcia Chatelain. Dr. Marcia Chatelain is a Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Georgetown University. She is the author of two books, one entitled Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, and I have it right here, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. Her next book will examine the history of college access programs and the specific ways that first-generation college students are transforming higher education. Chatelain has published pieces on the websites of The Atlantic and Time, as well as the Washington Post and the Chronicle of Higher Education. She was also a keynote speaker at the 2019 Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice. And so it's great to welcome Marcia back. So Marcia, welcome. Thanks for being with us tonight. We're excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the invitation. In light of recent events, I was on my book tour when everything kind of shut down. And so I just miss people. I miss being able to engage with people who are open to learning and want to talk about things in a deep way. So this is a pleasure for me to be here with all of you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, and I can empathize with that. I on Easter Sunday, we were sitting out in our front yard in the chairs at our house, and some adults walked by, and we didn't really know them that well, but we eagerly engaged them in conversation. For those of us that are, whether you're at home on your own or with a loved one or with kids or whatever, like adult conversation in person, face to face is, even via video screen is exciting. So it's great to have you. You mentioned your book tour. This crisis has obviously, put an end to the ability to travel around the country. I know you were here in my hometown of Cleveland earlier this year. Can you talk about, what the crisis has been like for you as a as a faculty member at Georgetown, who's typically, engaging people in person. And I know you mentioned before we got started that you and your husband live on campus there at Georgetown and things like that. So what's this been like for you?
I just, it's this incredible thing that oscillates from incredible moments of sadness and despair, and then these really beautiful moments of watching how people are engaging and really rising to the occasion. So I spend a lot of time on airplanes and hotels all over the country if I'm not, doing book talks or talking about Catholic universities and slavery. I'm doing teaching workshops. So in a given year, I go on 30 trips. So I'm on a plane like 60 times a year. And having the opportunity to kind of be in one place consistently has been really just illuminating for me, because it helps me embrace the value of stillness in my life. And this has been a forced stillness. But when I'm on campus, on an empty campus where there are very few students left, and the people that I see probably in sharper focus are the workers who are still coming to campus to clean the buildings, to provide limited food service, to do the groundskeeping on campus and construction projects. In many ways, I think this gift of being able to really see the people who are behind the institution has also been a point of reflection for me, as someone who's often concerned about wages and the ability for workers on campus to organize. I think that sometimes that can be kind of a lofty idea. Yes, I support the workers, but when you see the stress on people who are coming in to campus to maintain, order and to maintain cleanliness, and the absence of students, it really just kind of orients your vision of what an institution is, where the heart of it is. At Georgetown, it's been really amazing to see the different ways that students have had to say goodbye to their senior year, goodbye to their friends in such a rapid and emotionally charged way. And so I think for me, I am seeing things maybe from a different level of clarity, because all of the kind of filler is gone, and you're just kind of where you are, and you're able to really appreciate and value the people who still have to make themselves vulnerable so we can preserve the things that we have.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of conversation around at Catholic university campuses around the work of the contributions that so many people are continuing to make on those campuses, right? And especially for institutions that had students who remained on campus for a period of time. It sounds like there are still a few students who have remained at Georgetown for various reasons. Those that are supporting all the needs that they still have, right? Of some sort of dining service and housekeeping and all of that. And it's complicated for institutions then to figure out how to make sure to honor the health and safety of those individuals, especially when you factor in the element of many of those workers being contract employees from outside companies, and they're trying to solve their own kind of internal mechanisms for the the rights and dignity of their workers as well. So it's complex to be sure. Now, this crisis, as a historian, I would imagine that, as a historian, maybe we need to wait 50 years from now and ask you what you think of all this, but we're here today. So we'll ask you, what do you think historians will say about this time in history, looking back on it? And in particular, when I think about the focus of your writing and your, work, what will they say about issues of racial equity and racial justice or injustice as they look back on this time?
This is such a strange crisis for us today, because we have this narrative of the heroes of this moment. And we talk about the doctors and nurses who are contending with this incredibly difficult virus, and who are putting themselves at great risk to treat and care for others. And there's a clear sense that, these are the people on the front lines. And very recently, there's been an acknowledgement of the vulnerability of people who are ensuring our ability to buy groceries, people who are engaged in harvesting and preparing food in the food chain, the fast food workers who are still going to work to provide food for the truckers who have to have a place to, stop and eat. And so we're starting to see this kind of magnification of work. But one of the things I'm concerned about in the analysis is that the people who are most vulnerable in this moment are the people who still have to show up. But the disparity among these populations is the place where I hope we really take a step back when we think about risk. And so while it's incredible, the work that doctors and nurses are doing, they are very much in a different class of people than the nurses' aides and the hospital cafeteria staff and the hospital cleaners, but they're in the same space together, fighting coronavirus in solidarity together. And I think that this is a really important moment to recognize that we're all vulnerable to this virus, but our susceptibility to the ravages of it really is about where we started before this even began. And so I think the analysis 50 years from now was the coronavirus was a moment in which Americans had to be really reflective about what happens when inequality is at such an extreme level that when there is a crisis, only few people will really survive and thrive. And I think it's heartbreaking to see that even in the face of this tragedy, there's still contention about whether or not people deserve health care, or, should we recognize the rights of grocery delivery people to organize for better wages. So even though it has been laid bare, the needs and the vulnerability of people, we still are stuck in this paradigm that some are deserving of protection because their work, their labor, their sacrifice is more valuable than others. And so I hope that in 50 years, when I'm at the end, I'll be like 90, so maybe I will still be around, maybe I'll still have a career, that people will talk about this as the Great Awakening, in the spiritual sense, but in the social sense, that this was the Great Awakening that America needed in order to really protect all of its people. And there's a part of me, because I study history, that is skeptical that will happen. But I think part of the radical hope is that this is a moment of transformation, if not for all, for some, to really come closer to the ways that people in America live in such disparate realities, that even though this virus can affect anyone and everyone, what it really is doing is exposing the different places that people begin their lives.
Think a little bit about every once in a while you'll see a video on social media produced that tries to tell the story of how a product gets to you. Mm-hmm. There's one with strawberries that I really love, where they show you all the human hands that go into getting a strawberry to your breakfast cereal in the morning. And it makes me wonder if this crisis will enable us to understand the complexity and interconnectedness of our world, and the way that we depend on people in ways we don't even realize. And to your point, and we depend on people that we don't even see, right? The healthcare workers have been highlighted and gotten, and deservedly so, gotten a lot of attention in many cases. But there are so many people that are behind continuing to allow our country to operate as it is, that we don't, we're not even aware of, maybe. And
I think about this idea of sociologists and people in philosophy grounded in African American studies sometimes talk about this idea of slow death versus fast death in America. And when we talk about slow death or social death, we talk about the 1,000 cuts that undermine people's human dignity, their human freedom, their ability to make choices, their ability to create opportunities for themselves, their families, to ever get on the other side of struggle. And I think it's so interesting when I see, sometimes I'll see workers on campus, or I was chatting with a guy at Trader Joe's today, and I said, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And he kind of had this resigned look on his face. He says, like, I've been through a version of this my whole life. It was an older African-American man. He said, this idea that this virus is supposed to make me afraid, my whole life was about figuring out how I was going to survive. So this is just another day for me. He said, but for some people, they're finally realizing what this country is actually like. And I felt like, what an incredibly prescient and thoughtful and deep analysis. For some people, this kind of fear that a lot of people around the world are living under, this is called Tuesday, this is called Wednesday. And this idea that we have allowed people to be left behind and live in a constant state of fear about their health, their economic security, their safety. And now that it's been kind of shared with people across the economic ladder, across the world, it's called a crisis. But before we thought of COVID-19, there had been many crises that people were living, and there was a slow death that was happening in this country. And it's not having health insurance. It's not being able to feed yourself or your family. It's working, 18 out of 24 hours a day. It's being evicted. It's not having clean water. It's all of these things. And so I think what I hope happens is that after we're done with the kind of valorization of the frontline worker, it's interesting when you watch TV, all the major brands have already come up with their COVID commercials. And I'm like, when did they have time to shoot this commercial? Whether it's Papa John's or Ford or Dove, all of the brands have their message of solidarity, and they have the grizzled face of the first responders, and they have, the grocery worker in the mask as a hero. After all that nonsense is done, because that's marketing, I can't wait for someone to say, what our commercial is going to be? Someone talking about being completely afraid of getting this horrible disease and not knowing what to do with the bill after they survive it, or having to go into a job where there's no safety protocols because that your landlord will evict you if you're, within the 5-day window for your rent. And so I think that what I see us defaulting to is the easy appreciation instead of the hard appreciation for what people are really struggling with at this moment.
Yeah. For those who are just joining us, welcome to Solidarity on Tap. We're with Dr. Marcia Chatelain from Georgetown University. And Marcia, one of the things we try to do is recognize, normally at Solidarity on Tap, we do a roll call where we kind of, if anybody went to a Jesuit university or from different things. So we'll do a little bit of a roll call. It happens a little differently on here online, but I want to say hi to some folks. The JVs, the JVC House, Jesuit Volunteer Corps House in Newark is here with us. So welcome to Kyle and his fellow JVs. Brendan, thanks for joining us from Loyola Blakefield, right up the way from Marcia there in Baltimore area. Let's see. Julia is a Gonzaga Zag, was a JV in Cleveland. Welcome to Julia. Let's see. Father Rick Malloy is with us. He's asking how we get this on the Facebook page. We'll help him figure that out. Don't worry, Father. And then Greg, welcome. Greg's a BC High, a Georgetown grad, and then was a JV with JVC Northwest in Spokane. So welcome to Greg. And we'll do some more call outs in a little bit, but welcome to everyone. If you're just joining us, you can post where you're joining us from there in the comments on Facebook or YouTube, or tweet at us using the hashtag ISN Live. Marcia, can we jump to your most recent book, Franchise, for a second? So the first name of it is Franchise: The Golden Arches in Black America, and somehow we acquired a copy. I think you may have given it to some of my colleagues when you were in Cleveland. So thank you for that. We've been enjoying it, passing it around the office. And can you tell us a little bit about the background of the book? I mean, you focus obviously on the interplay of kind of the economics of the franchise model of McDonald's in relationship to Black communities, but can you give us a little bit of an overview of what you found as you put the book together? I
actually have I usually don't do product placements, but I actually want to illustrate something with the cover of the book. So the book looks at this period in the United States after 1968, when McDonald's moves from the suburbs into the inner city. And what precipitated that move was Martin Luther King's assassination and the uprisings in American cities that made people very vigilant about why these long-standing racial tensions existed in America. And essentially what happens in a lot of places, whether it's Los Angeles or Chicago or Newark, is that after these uprisings, they survey people and they say, what's going on in your America? And people identify, a lack of quality housing. They identify problems with getting an adequate education for their children. They talk about the problems of police brutality. And they also mention that in a lot of the stores that they patronize in their community, they were interested in buying from African Americans because they felt disrespected, overcharged for poor quality goods in stores. The reason I set up this framework is because amidst all of those very important concerns, the federal government became very invested in this idea of promoting African American business. And the way that they did it was they promoted this idea of Black capitalism and Black economic empowerment. And so they basically invited McDonald's to come into Black communities and install African-American franchise owners. And it was this idea that people would go to Black-owned McDonald's, they would support it, and they felt like they were supporting their community. And so I talk about the ways that the federal government, the civil rights establishment organizations, and McDonald's came together to bring what they framed as an opportunity to Black America and to really examine the history of a lot of the issues we talk about today. And in light of COVID, you may have seen the Surgeon General make a comment about African Americans being more susceptible to COVID because of pre-existing conditions. And he talks about hypertension and diabetes. Well, my book looks at how did we get here? How did a brand like McDonald's that grew up in the suburbs, how did it become such a fixture in poor Black communities? And I talk about the various structures that were failing African Americans that led to a world where people thought that fast food was going to be the next great thing. And I think in light of what we've been experiencing economically in this country, there will be a moment where people talk about reopening or rebuilding America. And my only contribution to this conversation is be very, very skeptical of the bad ideas that will emerge after this crisis, because we know that after a major crisis happens in this country, we have all of these market solutions. The private sector will find different ways to capitalize on the suffering and the discontent and the despair of people. And in very similar ways, franchise talks about the ways that after the despair of 1968, the fast food industry came in and made a lot of promises about being able to help support communities. But I think that we have to be very, very careful of giving up on public resources and the public good in favor of corporate solutions, because corporations, at the end of the day, are not invested in lifting up people. We, as people in solidarity, people together, we're in the business of lifting up people. And so the cover of the book is this woman in Portland, Oregon, who is getting sworn in to vote at a McDonald's. And it really represents the intersections of McDonald's as a brand, as a fast food company, as well as the ways that African Americans used McDonald's to meet the needs of communities that were being ignored and left behind.
One of the closing thoughts in the book talks about this idea, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but something to the effect of, it's not just about getting access to the lunch counter to have the hamburger. It's got to be more than that. Can you tell me where that came out? Because I think about having visited many of the key sites in the civil rights movement, and seeing those and thinking about how monumental some of those, access to things like equal services at a restaurant, or were important, but there's more to that.
Absolutely. So. In my moments of despair, I often, and I have been doing this more often than usual, I listen to 2 speeches of Martin Luther King, and most people have some of the I Have a Dream speech. But if you listen to the whole thing, I often joke that I think there's some former Georgetown students in the thread. I see one. I often joke that if the Pope took my civil rights history class, he would get an A+, because when he visited Washington, D.C. a few years ago, he went to the White House when Obama was in office, and he gave a speech about Washington, D.C. And he mentioned Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, but he didn't talk about I Have a Dream. He talked about the fact that Martin Luther King in that speech talks about how America has issued a bad check to African Americans. He says that the check has been stamped insufficient funds. And he talks about this betrayal of the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I give the Pope a lot of points for that, because it's such an important point about economic justice and racial justice have to go together, that they have to be in solidarity with each other as a framework, or it doesn't work. And so when Martin Luther King begins his year in 1967, talking about his anti-war stance, talking about his March on Washington for the Poor People's Campaign, he gives a speech at Stanford University, and then he goes to the Riverside Church, where he talks about militarism, racism, and capitalism as these three evils that are yoking America from being the kind of nation it imagines itself it could be. And then the night before he's assassinated, and these again are speeches that I highly recommend that you listen to on YouTube, he talks about economic justice. And he talks about why he's in Memphis, Tennessee, and that's for the sanitation workers strike. And he talks about economic justice, not in terms of, hey, everyone should have an opportunity to be a millionaire. He says, what do we do with this idea of making sure that people have an opportunity to stand in solidarity with the sanitation workers? We do it through economic boycott. We do it through withholding our desire for commercial goods, for certain foods. We hold that so that the businesses in our communities that are not investing in us, that they can feel the pain too, that the sanitation workers are feeling. And it's this idea that throughout the 1960s, there were a series of victories where federal legislation was saying it is illegal to discriminate against a person who wants to buy a hamburger. It's illegal to discriminate against someone who wants access to the vote. But there was no plan to help lift people out of the poverty conditions that they were languishing under. There was no plan to really make sure that people had equal access to affordable, decent housing. And so what I hope my book can do for people who really want to understand the brilliance of the civil rights movement is understand that people were not just saying everyone should have a chance. They were really interrogating, what does it mean for someone to have a chance in a civil society? And it's the ability for them to provide for themselves and for others. I think that we are at a point where we have to ask ourselves a really critical moral question about our vision for the future. On many of our college campuses, we see that we are trying to applaud innovation, and we talk about economic development, and we talk about these ideas. But is our goal to live in a world where no one is poor and everyone is a millionaire? Or are we asking ourselves, can a person be poor in our society and they still have a life that's imbued with dignity because of the ways they are treated and provided for? And I think that this is the tension that I try to examine when people are trying to figure out if wealth from the fast food industry is the direction of civil rights, or is it antithetical to some of those deeper questions that Martin Luther King was asking about what good is it if a man can go to a lunch counter if he can't afford a hamburger?
That's interesting. You mentioned Pope Francis and his visit to Washington, D.C. And then just this past Sunday, Easter Sunday, Pope Francis issues a letter to a group of social movements from across the world that he's met with a couple different times about the idea of pitching the idea of a universal basic income, which of course Dr. King talked about in 1967 and in 1968 as a part of the Poor People's Campaign movement. So it's funny you bring up those speeches, because I was just scurrying through those speeches the past couple of days trying to to deepen my understanding of this call, remembering that Pope Francis referenced Dr. King both at the White House as well as when he addressed Congress in 2015. So it's exciting to hear you mention that. Related to the book, you talked about the death of Michael Brown, the murder of Michael Brown in the book, and you talked about the McDonald's in Ferguson as this kind of unique place that was a hub of activity in so many different ways. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I'd love to know how you learned, how you came to understand the place that the McDonald's there in the center of Ferguson kind of played in the mix of it all.
Yeah, so one book that has been very influential in my thinking is Naomi Klein's book on disaster capitalism. And it's this idea that when we have these major erosions in civil society, when we have major tragedies, it opens up the space for these free market and capitalist ideas to kind of take over. And whether we're talking about Hurricane Katrina or we're talking about the change in leadership structures in South Africa, when there's these big changes, we see this gap. And it was that gap in 1968 that brought McDonald's into a lot of African American communities. And so in 2014, when I was watching the coverage of the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, I thought, this is perfect that this McDonald's is at the center of this chaos, because it was one of the few businesses that could remain open during the chaos. It was located in a place where police officers and protesters and journalists and observers were all kind of coming together. And in many ways, what I wanted my book to help people think about is, what does it mean for communities that are poor and without resources and predominantly African American, for the McDonald's to replace the role of the state and to be the place where the common, to be kind of the center of the community? What does it mean when it's a McDonald's and not a community center or not a church or not any other kind of non-market tied place? And so as I was watching this on, CNN and MSNBC, I thought to myself, this McDonald's is the epitome of my concerns. And I think it is not a coincidence that McDonald's is franchised by an African American whose father was the first Black mayor of East St. Louis, Illinois, and who very much sees himself as a bridge in the community between the business community and African Americans. He also provides a place with Wi-Fi for people who don't have it. It's air conditioned in the summer when people don't have air conditioning in their own homes. He often talks about all the college scholarships that he provides for his workers through the McDonald's Scholarship Program. And all of these acts of benevolence are fine, but I'm concerned when any community has to rely on a McDonald's to provide these resources, instead of knowing that in the interest of the common good, that the state and the community will make these resources available.
Yeah. And speaking of Ferguson, you were in response to Ferguson, you organized a kind of a social media campaign around what was happening in Ferguson that was called Ferguson Syllabus, right? Can you tell us about what that was? I mean, there was a Twitter element to that for sure.
So I know we have a few people from St. Ignatius in Chicago, where I went to high school, and I went to the University of Missouri in Columbia for college. And so I had visited Missouri a lot after college and spent a lot of time there. And I actually worked at one of the high school programs that the state used to provide for free for students. So I felt very connected to Missouri. And as I watched this uprising unfold in Ferguson, I just had two thoughts. The first one, I thought what it would be like for students in the Ferguson Fluorescent School District to go back to school in this climate and in this context. I knew that school was going to be postponed that school year. And I thought to myself, like, how painful it is for a young person to have a disruption to the school year. And the second thing I thought was, what kind of conversations are we going to all have as educators when we open in August or September about what was happening in America? I remember the uprising in Los Angeles in 1992 when I was in grade school. And I just remember that feeling of wanting to turn to school as a place to talk about my confusion and my fears about what was happening and not having that available to me. And so I'm a big believer that in a moment of crisis, we should learn new skills. We should just do the best with what we know we can do. And the thing that I am pretty good at is helping students have difficult conversations. And so I just asked other educators in the spirit of solidarity with the educators and students in Ferguson, Missouri, who wouldn't have a normal school year, in memory of Michael Brown, who had just graduated from high school and was on his way to a vocational training program, just in the spirit of feeling united that our classrooms can be a space in which we talk about difficult topics and really help our students understand that it's through learning and engaging that we're able to understand what's happening around us and to provide a frame. That we can all do that regardless of what we teach, because we are in the service of ensuring that our students take what they learn in the classroom and apply it in the world in ways to be more compassionate and thoughtful. And so I just ask people to contribute ideas, to take ideas from me under this hashtag Ferguson Syllabus. And what it helped start was educators working in the service of responding in crisis. So whether it was the uprising in Baltimore in 2015 after the death of Freddie Gray, whether it was after the election, most recently as a result of COVID, that scholars have a shorthand of the syllabus to come together and to say, we want to devote some of our time and our energy and talent to making sure our classrooms are places where students can be on the path to figuring out their own relationship to these really complex and difficult issues. Because the reality is that still for too many school communities, silence is the preferred response when we are really struggling with these big complex issues.
Thanks. I want to take a second, Marcia, just to take a little time out. We want to acknowledge our sponsors for Solidarity on Tap. So, and I also want to, there's a bunch of folks that have chimed in here to let us know that they're with us. But let me talk about the sponsors first, and then I'll get to that. First of all, I want to just acknowledge the Ignatian Solidarity Network, the organization I work with. One of the things I wanted to invite folks to think about in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis that our country and our world are facing, we'd like to invite those who are watching tonight to join us in asking Congress to pass a new relief package, which will protect those most in need, including measures to improve the economic security of the most vulnerable and address the unique health risks posed to people in our prisons, those who are migrants and immigrants, low-income communities, and communities of color, which already bear the burden of poor environmental and health conditions. And so if you're interested in taking action tonight, you can text the word COVID, C-O-V-I-D, to 202-800-1541. So again, that's COVID, and you're going to text that to 202-800-1541. You'll be directed to an action alert where you can take action tonight to stand with vulnerable communities. So in addition to that, I wanted to say thank you to the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, which offers an opportunity for a graduate study centered on core themes of solidarity, spirituality, service, and social justice. They have a diverse and vibrant community that supports students as they engage in theology grounded in faith and informed by lived experience. I want to say thank you to the Maryknoll lay missioners who work with those at the margins for a more just, compassionate, and sustainable world in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. To find out more about their immersion opportunities and how to serve, you can visit mklm.org. The Jesuit School of Theology, which is located in Berkeley, California, is an international center for the study of theology with classes on campus as well as online. Dynamic, challenging, and impassioned dialogical study impels and inspires graduates to pursue ministry in a way that will transform the world. Of course, the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, we heard about them earlier. The Jesuit Volunteer Corps is a full-time volunteer program that works for social justice while exploring spirituality and faith through a framework of Catholic Ignatian values for individuals between the ages of 21 and 35 years of age. The Jesuitical is a podcast from America Media hosted by young lay editors looking at the Catholic news of the week and includes guest interviews. So make sure to check them out at americamagazine.org. And JVC Northwest focuses on the core values of community, simple living, social and ecological justice, and spirituality and reflection. JVC Northwest is a national direct AmeriCorps program serving in 24 locales across Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. And you must be 21 or over to be eligible for the Jesuit Volunteer Corps Northwest. And I want to say hi to some of the folks that are joining us around the country. So welcome to Nicole, who's a Fordham University grad and joining us from Baltimore tonight. Welcome to Nicole. Here's somebody from St. Ignatius College Prep in Chicago, class of 08. Maureen, welcome. We're glad you're here. Megan is looks like her hometown's Cleveland, but she's a Xavier University student. So welcome to Megan. We're glad you're here. Adri, she's a class of 2019 from Georgetown, and from the up at the JVC house in Boston. So welcome. Peter is a Loyola New Orleans alum, and joining us from Fairbanks, Alaska. That might win the award for farthest away. Folks in Baltimore, they're at St. Ignatius Loyola Academy, are watching. Mary is with JVC Northwest in St. Xavier, Montana, the JV community there. Welcome. Let's see, we've got greetings from Salt Lake City from a former lay missionary volunteer who had served in Tanzania. There's Roxanne. So welcome to everyone. And again, if you want to take action on that action alert, you can text COVID, C-O-V-I-D, to 202-800-1541, and you'll be able to take action tonight to stand with vulnerable communities. So, Marcia, we've talked a lot about a lot tonight, but I wanted to make sure we got a chance to talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing at Georgetown with the working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. I was wondering if you could just, for those who aren't as familiar with that group, maybe don't know about that, could you talk a little bit about what that group has been doing there on campus for a number of years? And then I can ask you a couple other questions. So.
Yeah, so in 2015, President Jack DeGioia asked for a group of faculty, staff, students, alums to deliberate on a process of thinking about Georgetown University's history of slaveholding. And I think sometimes in the media representation of the story, it's like this was this hidden history that all of these people uncovered, when the reality is that American Catholic slaveholding has been something that people have been very aware of and have written about and analyzed. But from the perspective of 2015, as we greeted the Pope in Washington, D.C., as we thought about the continuing problems of racial injustice in this country and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, this was a wonderful time for Georgetown to think about this history. And so, for 1 year, we really deliberated on what was the best way for this history to animate how Georgetown sees itself as a university and moving forward. What emerged from that process was something that was a little unexpected for me, was that a group of people broadly defined as the descendants of people who were enslaved by the Maryland province of Jesuits and kept for the benefit of Georgetown University emerged as a result of this process. And since then, in 2016, when the New York Times broke one of the major stories about the connections among a group of people who are scattered across the country, many of them with origins in Louisiana, when they reconnected with Georgetown. And a lot of the work we did was about the specific 1838 sale of 272 men, women, and children off of plantations in southern Maryland into the slavery system of Louisiana. That's the short story. What emerged from that was other Catholic universities and colleges wanting to explore that history and inspiring that work in that context. And then it moved into some of the Ivy League institutions, some of the public state universities. And since then, Georgetown has been on a path to think about this history, and students have been on their own path for activism to create a framework of a reconciliation fund that speaks to some of these questions about reparations and the wealth gaps that exist as a result of not just slavery, but these aftermaths of slavery, whether it's Jim Crow racism, whether it's state-sanctioned violence through lynching, whether it's displacement and gentrification. Over the past few years, I've had the pleasure of traveling to other universities, those founded after the abolition of slavery in 1865, or the emancipation of enslaved people, and after the Civil War in 1865. And it's really interesting to see the ways that people are starting to use that model of inquiry to think about other ethical and moral issues with universities. So whether it's universities and the relationship between those institutions and Native American genocide and border wars with California and Texas, whether it's modern universities and their role in gentrification and displacement, whether it's land theft as a result of the creation of land grant institutions, this idea that a university's founding matters to how it proceeds in the world today has been really powerful. And I've seen some wonderful students and historians and community members and staffers and descendants of some of these historical wrongs really come together and shake up our idea of the benevolent or innocent university in order to push some of the critical issues we see today about just work policies, about graduate student unionization, about campus safety and racial equity and racial justice. And so I often think about, in terms of, my career thus far, of all the conversations that I've been able to be a part of, this one I think I'm proudest of because it has not only facilitated individual people connecting with their family members and better understanding their roots and the roots that helped create and sustain major institutions, but it has also challenged me to really rethink the place that I literally live, and that's the university, and the various ways that I can push up against this idea that universities are always all good and all generous, and to really help my students complicate their relationships to higher education as well.
And Marcia, I've heard you talk, or when you came to the Ignatian Family Teaching for Justice, you talked about growing up Catholic and going through Catholic school, and kind of knowing the church from that perspective. And one of the things I was curious about in light of the work of the Georgetown Committee was the way that the church was involved. I mean, obviously Georgetown is a Catholic university; it's a Jesuit university, and in 2017, as a part of the kind of reconciliation process, there was a liturgy of remembrance and contrition and hope on campus. And Father Tim Kosicki, who was representing the Jesuit Conference and the Jesuits of the United States, apologized to those whose ancestors had been enslaved. He said, "Today, the Society of Jesus, who helped establish Georgetown and whose leaders enslaved and mercilessly sold your ancestors, stand before you and say we have greatly sinned." And I was wondering, just in the context of Georgetown's identification as a Catholic university and the important role it plays in the church. I know that not everyone comes to Georgetown to experience, the Catholicism in the same way, but what do you think this, the work of the committee and the steps that Georgetown have taken mean for people who are Catholic, or for how Georgetown talks about its Catholicity?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting one, because I think this is where maybe some of me and my Catholic colleagues diverge. So I think that this idea that reconciliation, and I think Father Kosicki made this point. He says it's the beginning, it's not the end. And I think that that's absolutely true, that when one confesses the sin of racism and of worshiping white supremacy, this is kind of the start of something probably far more difficult and not as controllable. And I think that this is difficult and complicated work, because it is work that may not be resolved in one's lifetime, even if you are committed to it. And so for institutions that want to engage this question of slaveholding, of racial injustice, I think the thing that is so overwhelming is that an institution can commit itself to the work and never see repair in its fullest sense. And I think that can be really overwhelming. Um, I think that one of the hardest issues in this conversation is about reparations. How do we repay the debt? And is it about simply confessing the sin, or is it about trying to make people whole, knowing that the wholeness will never happen in the engagement? And I'm a big believer that if we are institutions that are grounded by a deep and abiding faith, then we should be ready to say we will give it all, right? Like if we thought about the idea that there's this great sin that has happened in the name of our institutions, and one day we say, okay, we're going to sell it all, we'll liquidate all of the assets and make repair. We do that with the deep faith that guides us to say that we can leave all of these things behind. And so I said that to a group of Jesuits in the Northeast, and some people had a look on their face like, are you kidding me? But I'm not. I really do believe that if we think that the sin is so great that the repair has to be deep and it has to hurt, then what if we said, okay, then we give it all up because we have this deep faith that God will bring us to the next place? And I think those are the moments of the tension, right? No one is asking Georgetown to close its doors and liquidate its assets rather, to repair for slavery. But can we imagine doing some of that? And what would that look like? And would that be an act of faith? Would that be an act of litigation? Like, what does that look like? And so I say all of these things because I think sometimes we imagine that these institutional engagements are just research projects. And then we realize that they can be racial justice initiatives. And then we can see that they are acts of repair. And then we see that there can be reconciliation. And then we have to stand in the fact that the kind of resolve or the kind of tension that we want to see end, we may not see it, but that these acts are important, and that they have to be full. And so I don't know what this work looks like moving forward, but I do know that I have been really impressed and really moved by the ways that it has animated the hearts of our students and their intellectual curiosity, and students who start a first year at Georgetown never thinking about the complexities of slaveholding and faith and race are deeply immersed in some of the justice movements around it. And those acts of transformation I find incredibly moving, because that's why we're all here. We're here so that we learn more things and then we act more compassionately in the world.
That's great. I think your point, just that there's the road is long, and we have to be open to the idea that we may not see the full journey, right? And I think that's a really good point. I want to come back to, you talked about the idea of an act of faith, and I mentioned earlier your keynote address at the Ignatian Family Teaching for Justice this past November, and you spoke about the opening portion of your address. You spoke about Liddell Lee's execution in Arkansas in 2017, and the fact that he requested to receive communion as his last meal before being executed. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose that story, and what that meant to you, and why you wanted to utilize that story as a way to kind of center what you shared with that crowd of 2,000 predominantly young people at the Ignatian Family Teaching for Justice?
Yeah, so I think when you first invited me for the teach-in, like months before, I figured maybe I would tell a story about the Georgetown Working Group on Slavery or something. And I remember reading that story, and I think Sister Helen Prejean like retweeted that story about this man's last meal being the Eucharist, and I was just so overwhelmed by that story. I remember teaching class later that, a few days later, and feeling the need to tell the students that story for no other reason than to think about this idea of sustenance, of faith. A lot of my teaching and writing is about food. And there's a way that fast food is sometimes negated because poor people eat it, or it's considered, the food of choice for communities of color. And so the ways that people sustain themselves with food, their choice of sustenance is often degraded for other reasons. And I just thought about that story. And then Sister Helen came to campus to talk about her spiritual memoir. I think it's called Hearts on Fire, about just about her spiritual path. And what she talked about was the ways that her advocacy around the death penalty was also in tandem with her own recognition of growing up in the South and of racial justice, and her work in New Orleans. And then I had the opportunity to do a Q&A with Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative. And he had come to Georgetown to screen the movie that was based on Just Mercy, which was his exploration of the death penalty in the criminal justice system. And this was a Hollywood movie about the death penalty. So I didn't expect it to be very moving. I thought, okay, maybe it's going to be corny. Maybe they're going to downplay, his own commitment to racial justice. And they didn't shy away from it. They depicted a scene where a man's life was taken by the state. And so in many ways, I think I was just so moved by this question of faith and sustenance. And after spending so much time talking to people about, Georgetown and slavery and reparations, and me thinking that, okay, if we are people of faith, we give it all away because we know that we'll be replenished, that our nourishment will come in a different form, even if we can't see it. And so I decided to talk about the artistic renderings of people's final meals, and this choice of your faith as the sustenance, not any of these, worldly goods. It was so inspirational to me. And as someone who, if you ask my mom, I could be a better Catholic. As someone who struggles with how faith is going to be made real in my life every single day and every single hour, as someone who can be very susceptible to being very grumpy and maybe a little snarky, it's these moments in which someone's faith is so clear, not because it's perfect, but it is articulated when it matters the most. I just feel like I have to tell someone about it. And, the idea that if this is the last moment of consciousness of the earthly world, that whatever it has to offer, that this isn't what this person wanted. They wanted the body of Christ. I mean, you hear that story, and I think it changes you, whether you're in a faith tradition or not. It makes you curious, and I think it ignites something in you. And I just wanted everyone else to have an opportunity to think about that.
That's great. It, as we said at the beginning, our hope was to reflect on the idea of radical hope, and you brought it up numerous times. And as I think the way I heard you tell that story, I think we can recognize the radical hope in his choice. Hope for something deeply rooted in Christ. So, Marcia, thank you so much for being with us tonight. This has been such a great discussion. It's as we said earlier, it's great to have just talk with adults, and we could do it in person, but nice to do it virtually, and wonderful to have people from all over the country and beyond joining us, particularly those who were able to gather in communities or groups to be with us. So thank you to everyone who joined us, and good luck with the rest of the semester and with what the coming months bring. We know that this will be a challenging time for higher education institutions to kind of navigate this crisis and to figure out how to sustain their missions, and the role of faculty will be integral in that. So we're grateful for your continued work, your continued writing, and historical analysis of what's happening in our country and our world. So thank you again. I'd like to share who will be joining us in the coming weeks. There'll be a little teaser here in a second, but next week we have a special program specifically for Earth Day, April 22nd. We'll be welcoming Molly Burhans, who's a graduate of Canisius College and founded and is the executive director of Good Lands, a project that tries to find ways for the Catholic Church to utilize its assets to respond to climate change. So we'll be joined by Molly. The following week, April 29th, Sister Simone Campbell will join us. Sister Simone is the Executive Director of Network Catholic Social Justice Lobby. And since Marcia mentioned Sister Helen Brejan, I can tell you that Sister Helen will join us on May 6th, Wednesday, May 6th. So again, thank you for being with us tonight here at Solidarity on Tap. We hope you'll join us next week. And if you were wondering, this is recorded and will be available on our YouTube page as well as on our Facebook page for you to access after tonight's broadcast. So thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful night.